Well, good morning. I show it's time to go ahead and get started for the class. So we are in. We have made our way through the majority of the. We made it through all of Ezra and the majority of Nehemiah. We should be able to wrap up today. You'd think after having gone through all of these, I'm sitting there turning into Ezekiel. Because I just can't think of the name of the book we're apparently studying, even though I put the notes together and everything. Turned to Ezekiel and I realized, there's a lot more chapters. I thought we were going to be done at chapter 13. Then I realized I'm not in the right book. Nehemiah is where we are today. So if you want to have your Bible open to Nehemiah 10, that is where we left off last time. And I do know what we were actually talking about, so I haven't completely lost my mind on that. So far in Nehemiah, what we've looked at from the beginning, kind of recapping the book as a whole. Artaxerxes, if you'll recall, had a cupbearer named Nehemiah, and he had compassion on him because Nehemiah kind of very boldly showed his emotions before Artaxerxes. And just that one act of showing his emotion, because of that close relationship, allowed Artaxerxes to realize something was really bothering him. He sends him back to Jerusalem for a lengthy period of time. What isn't obvious right away is he sends him back, not as cupbearer off on a little side journey, but instead as governor. And he sends him back as governor, ruling that area while he's gone. And the building of the wall of Jerusalem was the main reason why. That was what was bothering Nehemiah, was the fact that the house of God's built there, and it's surrounded by just complete rubble and ruin. And that doesn't make God look good, that his city can't even be walled up and protected, and it looked like it had been ransacked still. And so that starts to get rebuilt. Along the way, there was three primary guys, along with a lot of their associates and kind of their whole group, that were actively trying to stop this process. You had Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And so there's a lot that's going to go on during the course of time between those three. Nehemiah, though, trusted God would let them rebuild the wall. And so that's really what we see throughout this, is despite all obstacles, there was still hope that the walls can be built by putting their trust in God. Praise to God fervently. And he ends up also doing something about the threats that were there. They had active threats that we are going to sneak up and kill you while you try to build this wall. And they weren't just threats, they were plans. This was going to happen. So they thwarted the plans with God's help by posting guards and having a defense plan set up. And God was on their side. Nehemiah then stops a lot of the nobles from taking advantage of the poor. We see that one kind of chapter where it addresses an issue that was going on simultaneously during the time of the building of the wall. And the opposition keeps growing. It changes from directly, we're going to come kill you, and we're going to kill all the workers off and attack you and everything because you've figured out a way to stop that. Now they just need to get rid of Nehemiah. So they want to lure him out and to come meet him out in one of the villages in the plain of Ono. And it's, let's come out here, over and over and over again. And when that doesn't work, they hired someone to prophesy against him and say, you've got to get into the temple and save yourself. You're going to die if you don't. And they're wanting to discredit him in whatever way possible. And overall, through all this, the wall gets built. And so that's where we've kind of gotten through so far. And the people gather around in chapter 8 to hear the law read to them. And they all stand for hours and hours listening to this. And the scene is there of Nehemiah and his guys that are up there, the temple workers and some of the other leaders are all up on this platform that was built for this very occasion, standing before them, and he reads to them the law, and they decide to rededicate themselves to God. They're reminded of God's compassion as he tells them the whole kind of backstory of how did we get here. That we have messed up over and over and over again. And here's where we find ourselves. Once again, God is taking care of us. He's protecting us. He's finding a way for us. They confess their sins. They vow, we're not letting this happen again. We're not going to intermarry with the pagans that brought us into all of that pagan worship as it was. We're done with that. We're going to rededicate our lives. We're going to refocus, and we're going to do what we're supposed to be doing. So, in chapter 10, we see this promise being made, starting in verse 30. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us, or take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every seventh year, we will forego working the land and will cancel all debts. And so you see the promises made to do what was asked of them. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give a third of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our God, for the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings of the Sabbath, at the new moon feasts, and at the appointed festivals, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of God. In other words, we will give for the work of the house of God. And so here's, you've got your promises laid out. We're not going to intermarry. We are going to continue to work and assume this responsibility. We're not going to do all the things that we weren't supposed to do in the past. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have cast lots to determine when each of our family is to bring to the house of God at set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. So now they have to bring more supplies, and they're dividing out, setting up a sign-up list, basically through the casting of lots, who's bringing what meal when, and all that. That's the same kind of mentality that we have of things that we do when there's things that need to be done, and we divvy it up. They're dividing it up, and they're going to go carry it out. We also assume responsibility in the bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. As it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle and our herds and our flocks to the house of God, to the priests ministering there. And moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all of our trees and all of our new wine and olive oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. So again, now we're going to do everything that has been asked of us. Nehemiah 10 has a lot of promises being made by the people to do what they should be doing. That this is what was expected and prescribed in the law, that they should be doing these things. And they're attesting, after having the law read to them, after having the history of Israel re-taught to them and recounted to them, they commit themselves to doing this. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the storerooms, where the articles for the sanctuary and the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the musicians are also kept. We will not neglect the house of our God. And there you hear it out of their mouths. They said that we are not going to neglect this. So then chapter 11. So in chapter 11, we get this, and it becomes a laundry list of names, on the majority of the chapter. But we see how the people settle into that. The leaders often were the ones settling into Jerusalem. The rest of the people then cast their lots to bring 1 out of every 10 of their clans to live there. So you get 10% of Israel now deciding they're going to move into Jerusalem, to rebuild this city up into a hub of Israel. And by doing that, they're going to have them come from different tribes and different groups. So this is, again, the holy city, while the remaining 9 stay in their own towns. And the people were commended, all who volunteered then to live in Jerusalem. So those who are living in Jerusalem, as we go through the next few verses, come from the tribe of Judah. They come from the tribe of Benjamin. They are the priests. They are the Levites. They are the gatekeepers. So we skip down to verse 20. And it says, the rest of the Israelites with the priests and the Levites were all in the towns of Judah, each on their ancestral property. So they've resettled the land, and they've gone back now living, and things are kind of where they were beforehand, only this time, what's different? What's different from what it was prior to them being carted off into Babylonian captivity? What did they have leading up to that point? I mean, what was the structure? Maybe let's say it that way. What was the structure of Israel and Judah? They had kings. We don't see that playing itself out at this point. So it's a little bit different. They are back into their land. They're a nation of people that has been reformed. They went through the captivity, hopefully back on track. Sounds like after chapter 10, they've got their mind back where they should. They've got their devotion back where they should as well. And so They go back in verse 21. The temple servants lived on the hill of Ophel, and Ziha and Gishpa were in charge of them. The chief officer of the Levites in Jerusalem was Uzi, son of Bani, the son of Hashabiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Milcah. Uzi was one of Asaph's descendants, so we kind of see who he was, who were the musicians responsible for the service of the house of the Lord. The musicians were under the king's order, which regulated their daily activity. So we have these musicians and kind of the structure of where they're living, and the temple servants are out on the hill of Ophel, and then you've got the musicians living as well, kind of overseen by Uzi. And so really the remainder of that chapter, and even the beginning of chapter 12, is a list of where everybody ended up and all these descendants. And so we see that kind of going through. Now this doesn't include all the tribes. It is the tribes of Benjamin, Judah, and the Levites, and kind of the explanation of where they ended up and all of that. So we'll get up to verse 27 of chapter 12. Again, we can read a lot of names, but after I pronounce Joe Nathan the other day, I've decided I'm not going to read off all the names. That was mortifying. No, it wasn't that bad. So at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The music was also brought together from the region around Jerusalem, from the villages of the Netophathites. It's a weird one. From Beth Gilgal, and from the area of Geba and Asmaveth. For the musicians had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates, and the wall. Does anybody picture anything when you see an entire village of musicians? I'm just curious. The only reason I say that is we were recently, a couple of years ago, we were up in Alaska, and we went to this little town of Talkeetna, and that's what I picture in my mind, is this little rustic, kind of artsy little town. Kind of, if you ever get a chance, it was like the most quintessential little, just bohemian kind of little village. I kind of picture something like that. You know, they're all the musicians build themselves a little town, and it probably was a different looking town than the rest of the ones. If it's like our musicians of this day, you know, they just have a different flair to them. Yeah, so maybe it would have a little bit more artistic vibe going on in that town. So I don't know if it did or not, but that's where my mind goes, trying to picture this. So you actually have an entire town that the musicians all built. And so they really were. I'm glad somebody went there. And that is why you were right in picking on him. It is. No, you're right. They are. Moving on to verse 31. I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right toward the dung gate. Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah followed them, along with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, as well as some of the priests with trumpets, and also Zechariah, son of Jonathan, or Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zachar, the son of Asaph. So you have, picture this, 2 groups of, the 2 choirs. One choir, along with some other the leaders, go one way, walking along the top of the wall. This is where they start to kind of really rededicate the wall and have this praise for the wall being completed. It was completed. They all kind of recommit themselves. Now you've got this choir walking around one side to the right, and then on the other side we'll have another one. And his associates, Shemaiah, Azrael, Milalai, Galalai, Maya, or Mai, whatever, and more, with musical instruments prescribed by David, the man of God. Ezra, the teacher of the law, led the procession. So that's the one side, going around to the right. Ezra's at the lead. You've got a full choir, got some priests with trumpets, and a whole lot of other guys all walking on one side. At the fountain gate, they continued directly up the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall and passed above the site of David's palace to the water gate on the east. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the tower of the ovens to the broad wall, over the gate of Ephraim, the Jeshanah gate, the fish gate, the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100 as far as the sheep gate. And at the gate of the guard, they stopped. And so they've kind of surrounded around now, and they're at two different gates after having walked around there. The two choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials as well as the priests, and he lists those off. And also a few more there gets us all the way down to where the choir sang under the direction of Jezrahiah. And on that day, they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. When is the last time we were given that same description? Do you remember what the event was? It was back in Ezra. I'll give you a hint there. It was not the full amount. It was when the foundation of the temple was laid, they all started realizing it's happening. It's coming back. And this great rejoicing, this between rejoicing and wailing, over tears of joy and disbelief and everything else back in Ezra, it could be heard for miles around. And here now we have two full choirs singing, coming from the same spot, the house of God, but it's rebuilt, and they've walked the new walls. And now they've come into this, and now they're sacrificing, they're praising, and it could be heard from far away. I don't know how far away it would be, but imagine a couple miles away, you're out in a field tending sheep outside of Jerusalem or whatever you might be doing out there, and you hear the sound of this roar coming from in there. And so, again, you can imagine just this sound that would have been heard for a long distance away of what a great, joyful assembly has gone and just excited that Jerusalem is back, that Israel is back, that it happened. They got back. What God said they were going to get back. And with the help of Nehemiah, he's got them back on track. And so everything's going swimmingly at this point. At that time, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites, for Judah was pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, and did also the musicians and gatekeepers according to the commands of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there had been directors of the musicians for the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So, in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel contributed the daily portions for all the musicians, or for the musicians and the gatekeepers, and they also set aside a portion for the other Levites, and the Levites set aside the portion for the descendants of Aaron. So what do we see here? We see basically we're back to the way it started in the days of David and Solomon and Asaph, when there was all of these commands given to the people and they were doing it. They were giving to the work of the house of God. They were making these gifts so that the Levites could continue to focus on doing the work of God, and so that the priest could be cared for, the musicians, the gatekeepers, everybody could be cared for, so that there was protection and there was functionality to the house of God back in those days. Now in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah, this is happening again. And so we see this, it's back on track, it's happening the way it once was, and then the Levites are also kind of caretaking the money and making sure it gets to the descendants of Aaron as well. Chapter 13 comes along, and in chapter 13 we see a bit of we're going to see a time kind of jump halfway through this. So he says in verse 1, "On that day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent." Again, kind of that purification of God's people. We talked a little bit about that this morning, of what great thing it is to be on this side of the cross, because we would have been pushed out. during that time. We would not have qualified under who was the qualifying people of those days. Now, the door has been opened to a lot more. And so we're so fortunate, so blessed to be on this side of the cross. But then they had to purify themselves. Why? What was the main reason of why God kept asking them to rid themselves of these foreigners? What came with the foreigners? Their religion and their practices of the religion. And that it was, they brought with them sinful practices of a pagan living, and they brought with them the doubt that was being implanted into the Israelites that there were other gods that should be worshiped, and that doubt of God as being the one and only God. And by doing that, every single time, without fail, when the foreigners brought in their practices, the Israelites fall farther and farther away. And he wants them to not do that. God doesn't hate the other people in the sense of who they are. He hates the practices they were bringing in. And he stops that by not letting them be part of his people. What is it that is so vitally important that's going on in this, just in this window of time with God's plan? What's so vitally important of what's happening here? I mean, if you pull out any particular section of Old Testament, you'll see it's a section of God's plan, right? In this section, what is really, truly important about what's happening during this period of time?
He's trying to make them a distinctive people.
And what is that going to do? All right.
And he's trying to get them to not be involved, as the thought that from your previous question, bad company corrupts good morals.
Right.
Although that's a New Testament passage, it fits an inference to what he's talking about here.
So and you're right. So what's hinged on this? What's the next, historically, what comes next?
Well, they're still under bondage. They're still under foreign rule, but I don't know what you mean by what comes next.
Well, that's the tough part of this question. Where are we getting close to? We're in the 400s BC. We're getting closer and closer to Christ. We're also about to enter into that little gap of recorded time. We're about to get to the intertestamental window of time. But we do see what happens during that time because, you're right, the Greeks and the Romans are going to come in. The Greeks are going to actively try to stop the worship. So if they're not strong enough to make it through the Greek Empire, now what do the Romans allow? You can practice your own religion. Just pay us your taxes. Like that's essentially the Roman, empire to the Jews in a nutshell. If you really want to do things, don't do anything against us and keep paying us money, and you guys can do whatever you want. I don't care what you do over there. That's kind of the Roman aspect. What was the Greek idea was to Hellenize them, which to make them more Greek. I'm going to insert my religion into you. I'm going to insert to your society. It has to be more like me. And all of a sudden all these pagan things get thrown at them. Well, if they're not ready for that, particularly during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, which we talked a little bit about during Daniel, if they're not ready for those tests that are going to come their way, there's going to be some real big problems. Well, we're getting toward the tail end of where we really get to see the recorded period of time of what happens to God's people in Israel. Other than historical references that we can get from people like Josephus and some other very well-known historians that have accounted for that scripturally, we're about to run out timeline-wise of where we really get to see what was going on with them. And so we see this where God has got to get his people ready so that he can get them to Christ. Christ will come when the time is just right. And that time was going to be just right during a time of essentially the closest we got to a kind of a world network system of peaceful transport where the word could be spread rapidly. And that really fell into the Roman Empire. And he knew it was coming then. How does he get them from point A to point B, or from this point Q to point, whatever the next point is they're going to. They're I don't even know, there's still RST and everything. How do they get all the way down to Z? There's all these places that he's got to get them to. Well, he sees that they need to be strengthened. He sees that the foreigners will lead them astray during that time, and he casts them out. You can kind of see it in hindsight better than what they could probably see there. What they see is that, well, they've messed with us before, let's get rid of them and toss them out. Now, before this, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priest. But while this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. All right, so this is now, he's kind of reflecting back after trying to get things back. He's again, now 13 comes around, time has gone on. And so he had already gone back to the palace, and he's been working with Artaxerxes again. And then he comes back to Jerusalem, and he's going to see whether or not this worked. You know, he was governor for 12 years. Then he goes back in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, because he left in the 20th year. That's how he knew him so well for 20 years. Then 12 years he's gone, and now 32 years into Artaxerxes' reign, Nehemiah's back with the king. Then a few years later, he's going to go back again, and he's going to come back. When he goes back, who does he find living in the house of God? Tobiah. Remember that list of Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem? That's the same Tobiah. The one who said, let's build it alongside you so that we can get just as much credit. And then when they couldn't do that, he said, fine, you guys can't build that wall. And then it was like, oh, you're going to build that wall? Fine, we're going to kill you. And then he said, all right, fine. How about this? We'll just kill Nehemiah. Come out to this plain. We'll meet you out here. And when that wouldn't happen, they hire somebody to say, go completely discredit yourself by go hiding inside the temple. That Tobiah was allowed to come live inside the house of God in one of the storerooms. So Nehemiah is not there when this happens. Sometime later, I asked his permission, talking about Artaxerxes, and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I don't think he was like, let's get these things boxed up and we're going to set them out here in the hallway and give them an opportunity to come get it. I picture Nehemiah doing what he said. I was greatly displeased and I threw them out of that room. I think you could hear clanking and wood frame of a bed bursting and everything else being thrown out into the hallway or out into the courtyard there. And everybody watched as Nehemiah lost his mind. That's the way I picture it. I don't know if it's exactly the way, but knowing what Nehemiah has done and how fervently he wanted the people to get back on track and how much he has prayed to God, save us from Tobiah and all of what he and all of his cronies are doing and everything, to then leave and go back to the palace with Artaxerxes and a little while later come back and find the absolute worst possible resident in the courtyard area of the house of God to be just living it up there. I can't imagine his reaction was pleasant. I mean, he was greatly displeased. Threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room, and I gave orders to purify the rooms. And then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. That's what was booted out to give Tobiah a spot. Oh, we don't need that stuff. We just use that in the temple. Tobiah, we'll let him live it. Eliashib did some terrible thing there. And it was referred to as the evil thing he had done. I mean, this is terrible. Tobiah, like many of the other ones that we see through Ezra and everything, they sure talk a good talk like they're worshipers of God, and they try to play both sides on this one. And they get some of their people even kind of tied in as some of the leaders in Israel play both sides. And we'll be really chummy with Nehemiah for when he's around, but when he goes back to Artaxerxes, Tobiah's a tough guy. We better be good with him too, and we'll get him a good spot in here. I mean, this is terrible. This is, the worst possible thing. This is the leader of a terrorist group to them, living in their church building. I mean, that's kind of what you've got. Like, that is hard to wrap your mind around how horrific of a thing Eliashib did by letting Tobiah live in there. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and the musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. Probably had no choice. They couldn't even live because nobody was giving them their stuff. Everything was going fine. Nehemiah goes back to Artaxerxes, and it's like, seriously, guys, we just got this organized again, and now it all stopped. And I guess at the root of all that is if Eliashib is letting Tobiah in there, they don't really care what they're doing. You know, this commitment we saw in chapter 10, which was so wholehearted, is already unraveling right before them. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zachar, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I've done so faithfully, or what I've so faithfully done for the house of my God and in its services. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. What did they say a few chapters ago? Yeah, they'll have to sit outside of town. We're not doing that. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to make it a holy day. We're not even going to let them, if the foreigners bring anything to us to try to sell, they have to sit outside the gate for the whole day. And they'll eventually figure out we're closed on the Sabbath. That was their approach. And that's changed as well. And so promise after promise keeps kind of eroding away right before them. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? And now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath? Grabbing them by the shoulders, figuratively, and just shaking them like, did you not learn anything? Does captivity in the Babylonian lands not ring a bell? Do you not remember this? Remember how under the threat of death we had to build this wall back because it got torn down by Nebuchadnezzar's group? Do you not remember any of this? And now you're doing the exact thing that caused all of that to happen. And so the frustration, I think, for Nehemiah is real. And so his response is, God, remember me. This was not me. Because this is all during his time of governing, that he was the one that was the governor. He leaves and he comes back and it's completely unraveled. And so he prays to God, it's not me, I've tried. He just not that God needed the reminder, but he's pouring out his heart and his feelings there of like, God, remember me. This is not my doing. I did not call for this. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem, but I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned among the many nations? I think I skipped a couple verses. Hang on a second. I didn't have that one up there. He said on that one, he said, remember me, this is the part that's not up on the screen. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. That's how mixed up in the foreign living that they had gone, so where they were not. What is the warning in Proverbs about yoking yourselves? Not unequally yoking. This is unequally yoking. You can see who's steering this one. On that one, he's clearly seeing this to where their children don't even speak the language. That's how far into the foreign life they've kind of found themselves. Living in that land, but instead not living a life that would be of an Israelite. So I rebuked them and called down curses on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. And then he said, was it not because of intermarriages like this that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we now hear that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Jodah, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Eliashib, that name sounds familiar. What did he last do? Gave the room to Tobiah. And who is it? One of the sons of Jodah, his son, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat. Well, there's what the intermarriages are doing. They're completely clouding the judgment, because now that you're a part of that family, Sanballat's got his ends to that. Tobiah's living in that room. Like, all these things are happening. And so again, therein lies the problem. And I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God. So that's kind of how Nehemiah wraps up. It's like, all right, what do you think happens next? I mean, if history repeats itself again, take 63. Probably was very much like the ones before that. And so over time, a couple of groups start to kind of emerge. Groups that are going to be very fervently following God's word, while other groups are not. And eventually, it leads up to groups like the Pharisees. And it becomes more clear of why those groups probably existed. Probably initially for very good motivation of a core group of people who are going to make sure everything stays on the right path. But even that core group of people who are trying to stay on the right path ultimately made that right path the end-all, be-all, and not God. And they found a way to mess up even by doing the right thing. The Pharisees so often were doing the right thing over the years. Not always, but very often were doing the right thing. And by doing the right thing, they made doing the right thing more important than God, if that makes sense. And by doing the right thing, it almost became just doing the things on the list. And they were no longer the right things to do. They were the things you just had to do. And that became what now becomes an adjective for us of being Pharisaical. And so all of this leads out of this constant battle back and forth of falling away, get back on track, falling away, get back on track. All right, so let's wrap up this lesson instead of ones that we've done. Way back in the days of Daniel, you'll remember that God used Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument to get his people out of that area, and he wanted to make sure he got them in a position where his stuff from the temple would be protected and his people would be protected. During the time of captivity, the kingdom changes hands. After the writing on the wall, there is no more Babylonians. It is now the Medo-Persians. In that process of a change to the Medo-Persians, Daniel, who'd already been elevating him kind of in importance, gets even higher in position of influence, which was great because it was that influence that allowed Darius and eventually Cyrus to be willing to write down in a law that could never be changed that allowed them to go back and rebuild. And so not only could they, with safe passage, they get the financing given to them, paid for by the Medo-Persians. Really, truly, they're going to build a wall, and it's going to be paid for by the Medo-Persians. You know, it's kind of like the irony is just, it's funny that but this time it really happened that way. Now, in the days of Ezra, during that, God had his people then return to Jerusalem. The first wave of them go back. And the very first thing they do is they rebuild the altar. Then they lay down the foundation. Then there's that big, huge, jubilant praise that could be heard for miles around. And they reestablish worship. Nehemiah is heartbroken over the fact that that's going on and the rest of the area looks terrible. So then he rebuilds the wall against all of that threat of attack, and time after time after time he tries to get them back on track and struggles because of the stubbornness of the people and their constant desire to do whatever they think they should get to do. The same problems that brought them captivity was about to do it again. And had it not been for guys like Nehemiah, who was constantly, literally pulling their hair out and beating them, if that's what it took, to get them back on track. You can see the fervent desire to do the right thing out of people like Nehemiah, while others kind of trailed off. Anybody have any thoughts? We've got a couple minutes.
Wonderful.
This particular these books, when you link them together historically and you kind of see how they really truly match up together, there's a huge amount of encouragement that comes out of these passages. So it was suggested, to go on from here, that never got any additional suggestions, so I guess we're going to take Judith's suggestion. We're going to go on to the book of Revelation next. So I was trying to decide if I should start it on Labor Day weekend or not, but I think we will, because otherwise I have to come up with a one-time lesson, and my mind's already focused on that's where we're going, so we will pick that up next time. So hopefully that goes well. No, I actually do like teaching from that, and if there's a lot now that Daniel is fresh in our mind. That's really important because it really helps to understand the book of Revelation when you understand why the particular symbology is used, because that symbolic language, which was used in the book of Daniel, only makes sense to them, and they're able to get a message spread around a lot more easily if they mimic the same conversational kind of, beasts of, the different heads and all the horns and all that kind of stuff that we read about in Daniel. They're going to use that same kind of literary form in Revelation so that the people who might have come across it would have no idea what it's about, but the recipients would. And once we understand that, Revelation becomes extremely clear and encouraging of what kind of a message was really being spread there. So, all right, 3 minutes early. I know Zach has told me he likes it to end spot on. 3 minutes early acceptable? All right. Better than 3 minutes late, right? So, all right, have a good week.